Captain Derek Morrison stood in the enlisted men's barracks at Nui Dat in December 1966 and stared at what could only be described as a collection of anatomical impossibilities. 23 Australian soldiers, dressed in standard jungle fatigues, were conducting physical training exercises in the oppressive heat of a Vietnamese afternoon. No weights, no equipment, just body weight movement, repeated with the kind of mechanical efficiency that suggested these men had been doing this since childhood. Morrison was 26 years old. He had graduated from West Point. He had completed Ranger School. He had conducted operations in Vietnam for 6 months. He considered himself reasonably fit. Watching the Australian soldiers exercise was the most humbling experience of his military career. The sergeant in charge of the Australian group was a man named Thomas Brennan, 31 years old, with the build of someone who had been sculpted from stone. Shoulders so broad they seemed to create their own gravitational field. Chest carved with the kind of definition that suggested his body fat percentage was somewhere in the single digits. Legs that looked like they had been engineered in some military manufacturing facility rather than developed through normal human physiology. But it was not just Brennan. Every Australian soldier in the group displayed the same characteristics: lean, muscular, defined. The kind of physiques that would not have looked out of place on a Greek statue or anatomy textbook illustration of ideal male musculature. Morrison watched as Brennan led the group through a series of exercises: push-ups, pull-ups, handstand holds, pistol squats. Each movement executed with perfect form, repeated for impossible numbers of repetitions, performed in heat that was causing most American soldiers to simply stop moving. "What kind of training produces this?" Morrison asked an Australian corporal named James Fletcher, who was also observing the session. Fletcher smiled slightly. "This is just maintenance, sir. The real training is what happens when we are in the field." Morrison did not understand this response. "What do you mean, maintenance?" Fletcher gestured toward the training group. "Most of these soldiers have been in operational units for 2 to 3 years. They maintain physical conditioning through regular exercise, but the actual development of physique occurs during operational deployments. The jungle itself becomes the training ground." Morrison watched as Brennan moved through a series of one-arm pull-ups, executing them with the ease of someone doing a casual warm-up rather than an advanced exercise that most American soldiers could not do at all. "How many repetitions?" Morrison asked. 20 per arm, Fletcher replied. "That is considered normal completion. High performers might do 30 to 40. Morrison felt something shifting in his understanding. This was not normal military fitness. This was something different. This was physique development that exceeded what American military training typically produced. He requested a meeting with Major Peter Ashford, the Australian Engineer Company commander. When they sat in Ashford's office, Morrison attempted to broach the subject delicately. "I have observed that your soldiers possess exceptionally well-developed physiques," Morrison said carefully. "This is not a criticism. It is an observation of superior physical conditioning. I am curious about your training methodology." Ashford leaned back in his chair. "You have noticed the physiques. Most American officers notice the physiques before they notice the methodology, or the doctrine, or the tactical effectiveness. It is a curious thing, this emphasis on appearance rather than substance." "I am not emphasizing appearance," Morrison said. "I am attempting to understand how your training produces these results." Ashford stood and walked to a window overlooking the training area. "The physiques you see are not the primary objective of our training. They are a secondary consequence. The primary objective is functional strength and endurance in operational environments. The physiques are simply what happens when soldiers develop genuine functional capability rather than training for aesthetics." "What is the difference?" Morrison asked. "The difference is foundational," Ashford replied. "American military training, particularly in regular Army units, tends to emphasize standardized exercise routines performed in controlled conditions, running on flat ground, weightlifting with fixed barbells, sit-ups on padded mats. These are aesthetically efficient exercises that produce measurable improvements in fitness metrics. Australian military training emphasizes movement in varied terrain, carrying loads of varying weight, adapting to environmental conditions that are constantly changing. The jungle becomes the gym. The requirement to move quickly while carrying supplies becomes the exercise. The need to climb hills and navigate obstacles becomes the training methodology. But there must be a training program, Morrison said, some systematic approach to physical development. There is, Ashford confirmed, but it is not dependent on equipment or controlled environments. It is dependent on moving your body effectively in difficult conditions, repeatedly, until capability develops. A soldier who has spent 6 months carrying supplies through jungle terrain while navigating obstacles and managing fatigue develops a different kind of physique than a soldier who has spent 6 months running on flat ground and lifting weights in a climate-controlled facility. Morrison watched the Australian soldiers continuing their exercises. They moved with an economy of motion that suggested every movement had purpose. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary motion, just efficient, powerful movement, repeated for high repetitions. Can this physique be developed outside of jungle conditions? Morrison asked. Ashford considered the question. To some degree, yes. The principles can be adapted. But the jungle is the optimal training ground, because the jungle provides the environmental stresses that develop functional physique. Varied terrain, unpredictable obstacles, heat and humidity, fatigue from extended operations. These create the stimulus that develops the kind of physique you are observing. Morrison made a decision. I want to understand this methodology. I want to implement a training program for American soldiers that produces similar results. Ashford smiled. That will be difficult, Captain. The methodology requires accepting principles that run counter to American military culture. But if you are willing to learn, I can teach you. The training that Ashford conducted with Morrison over the next several weeks was fundamentally different from American physical training methodology. It did not involve barbells or dumbbells. It did not involve treadmills or stationary bikes. It involved bodyweight movement, progressive increase in difficulty, and the principle that functional strength was more valuable than aesthetic strength. Ashford began with a baseline assessment. He observed Morrison performing standard exercises: push-ups, pull-ups, running, sit-ups. From this assessment, Ashford determined that Morrison was reasonably fit by American military standards, but had significant deficiencies in functional movement capability. The first thing you must understand, Ashford said, is that your physique is not adapted to jungle warfare. Your muscles are developed for specific, isolated movements. Military operations in jungle terrain require integrated functional strength across all movement patterns. You can do 20 push-ups in a controlled environment, but can you do 20 one-arm push-ups? Can you do them after climbing a steep hill while carrying a heavy pack? Morrison attempted one-arm push-ups and failed after 3 repetitions. This is what I mean by functional strength, Ashford said. You have developed strength for a specific movement. You have not developed the integrated strength that combat operations require. Ashford's training program began modestly. 3 days per week, Morrison would conduct training with Ashford and several Australian soldiers. The training involved body weight movements, progressive increase in repetitions and difficulty, and exposure to the environmental stresses that jungle operations entailed. The first week, Morrison could barely keep up with the Australian soldiers. One-arm pull-ups, which the Australians executed with ease, left Morrison exhausted after attempting a few repetitions. Pistol squats, a movement that seemed absurdly difficult, demonstrated that Morrison's legs, while capable of running long distances, lacked the kind of functional strength required for climbing hills while carrying heavy loads. By the second week, Morrison began to understand the methodology. The exercises were not random. They were specifically designed to develop the kind of strength and movement capability that jungle operations required. Pulling exercises developed the strength needed to climb. Pressing exercises developed the strength needed to move obstacles. Leg exercises developed the kind of strength needed to move quickly through difficult terrain. More importantly, the exercises were scalable. You did not do a pull-up in one specific way. You did variations that allowed for progressive difficulty. Dead hangs for grip strength. Negative pull-ups where you lowered yourself slowly. One-arm assisted pull-ups. Full one-arm pull-ups. Each variation built toward greater capability. By the fourth week, Morrison's physique was beginning to change visibly. His clothing was becoming looser around the waist, while fitting tighter across the shoulders and chest. His arms were becoming more defined. His legs were developing the kind of muscular definition he had never possessed before. More significantly, his functional capability was increasing dramatically. Movements that had been impossible 4 weeks earlier were becoming routine. Movements that had been extremely difficult were becoming moderately difficult. The progression was visible and measurable. Ashford observed this transformation with quiet satisfaction. "You are beginning to understand," he said, after one particularly difficult training session. "The physique is not the goal. The physique is the evidence that functional capability is developing. When soldiers develop genuine functional capability, their bodies adapt by developing the musculature necessary to support that capability." Morrison asked the question that was beginning to obsess him. "How do the Australian soldiers develop physiques like Brennan's?" Ashford gestured toward Brennan, who was conducting handstand push-ups against a wall. "You are observing 3 years of continuous development," Ashford said. 3 years of training in jungle environments. 3 years of carrying loads through difficult terrain. 3 years of operational requirements driving physical adaptation. That is not something you develop in 4 weeks or 4 months. That is the result of sustained, progressive physical challenge in the context of actual military operations. Brennan, who had overheard the conversation, joined them. "Sir, it is mostly genetic predisposition combined with consistent training and consistent diet. Some of us have physiques that respond well to the kind of training we conduct. Some do not. But everyone who has spent time in operational roles develops greater functional capability than they possessed when they arrived." "What is the diet component?" Morrison asked. "Limited supplies in the field mean limited calories," Brennan replied. "You consume what is available. In the jungle, you often consume cold rations with limited nutrition. You burn enormous amounts of calories conducting operations. The combination of high caloric expenditure and limited caloric intake naturally produces low body fat. Add in the training stimulus and you develop muscularity without attempting to do so." This explanation made sense to Morrison. The Australian physiques were not the result of sophisticated training systems or specialized nutrition. They were the result of environmental pressures combined with consistent training principles. The jungle was simultaneously the training ground and the dietary constraint that produced the physiques Morrison observed. Over the next 3 months, Morrison became increasingly involved in understanding Australian training methodology. He conducted regular training sessions with Ashford. He observed Australian soldiers during operational preparation. He asked endless questions about how training translated into operational capability. What emerged was a comprehensive understanding of how environmental pressures shaped military physiology. The Australian soldiers were not stronger in every way than American soldiers. They were not capable of lifting heavier weights. They did not possess greater raw muscular mass. But they possessed something different. They possessed functional strength, developed through continuous exposure to environmental stress. They possessed the ability to move efficiently in difficult terrain. They possessed the kind of muscular definition that came from low body fat combined with functional muscle development. More importantly, they possessed endurance. A training session with Australian soldiers would begin at 6 in the morning and continue in some form for 12 to 14 hours. Training included physical exercises, movement practice, reconnaissance exercises, and operational simulations. By the end, most American soldiers who participated were exhausted. The Australian soldiers were simply performing normal training activity. This was their standard day. Extended duration physical activity in hot, humid conditions was simply the baseline of their training experience. Morrison began to understand that the Australian physiques were not a product of specialized training. They were a product of operational necessity combined with training principles that accepted the operational environment as the training ground. By March 1967, Morrison had developed a physique that would have been remarkable by American military standards. His body fat had dropped to approximately 8%. His muscle definition rivaled that of professional athletes. His functional strength had increased dramatically. But more significantly, his operational capability had increased. He could climb hills faster while carrying heavier loads. He could navigate difficult terrain with greater efficiency. He could maintain performance standards in heat and humidity that would have debilitated him 6 months earlier. Ashford observed the transformation with satisfaction. "You are beginning to understand," he said. "The physique is secondary. Capability is primary. When you develop genuine capability, the physique develops naturally." Morrison returned to Long Bin and faced a significant challenge. Other American officers noticed his transformation. They noticed his new physique. They noticed his improved physical performance. They wanted to know how he had achieved this. When Morrison attempted to explain the training methodology, he encountered skepticism. American officers, particularly those with backgrounds in athletics or physical training, were accustomed to specific prescribed exercise routines. The idea that physique could be developed through progressive environmental stress combined with body weight exercises seemed inefficient. One senior colonel named Harrison viewed Morrison's physique with visible skepticism. "How much are you bench pressing?" Harrison asked. "I am not bench pressing at all," Morrison replied. "I have not touched a barbell in 3 months." Harrison's expression suggested he had heard something nonsensical. "You have developed that physique without bench pressing? That is impossible."
"I have developed it through bodyweight exercises, progressive functional movement training, and the kind of physical stress that jungle operations entail."
Colonel Harrison was unconvinced. The physical transformation Morrison had achieved was real and measurable, but it did not conform to Harrison's understanding of how physique development occurred. In Harrison's experience, significant physique development required barbells, dumbbells, and structured weight training programs. The encounter highlighted a fundamental difference in how American and Australian military personnel approached physical development. American military culture emphasized standardized training protocols. Everyone performed the same exercises in the same manner, using the same equipment. Progress was measured in concrete terms. How much weight could you lift? How fast could you run a mile? Australian military culture emphasized functional capability in operational context. Training was adapted to environmental conditions. Progress was measured in operational terms. Could you navigate terrain faster while carrying heavier loads? Could you maintain performance in extended operations? Morrison attempted to introduce Australian training methodology to American soldiers at Long Bin. He organized training sessions. He explained the principles. He demonstrated the exercises. The response was mixed. Some soldiers recognized immediately that Australian methodology produced superior functional capability. Others were skeptical, dismissing the approach as inefficient because it did not involve traditional weight training. The skepticism was particularly strong among senior NCOs, who had spent careers implementing standardized physical training programs. They viewed Morrison's Australian-influenced methodology as a threat to their authority and expertise. But word spread through the American military. Morrison's physique was extraordinary by any standard. His functional capability in operational conditions was superior to that of soldiers who had developed physique through traditional weight training. The results were visible and difficult to dismiss. By late 1967, other American officers were requesting training from Morrison. They wanted to understand the methodology. They wanted to develop the kind of physique and functional capability that the Australians possessed. Morrison began conducting informal training sessions for interested officers and soldiers. These sessions followed the principles that Ashford had taught him: bodyweight exercises, progressive difficulty, environmental stress as part of the training stimulus, extended duration training that simulated operational conditions. The results were consistent. Soldiers who engaged in Australian-influenced training developed physiques that were dramatically superior to soldiers who engaged in traditional weight training programs. More importantly, they developed functional capability that was superior to their weight-trained counterparts. This created a challenge for the American military training establishment. The traditional approach to physical training was being demonstrated to produce inferior results. But changing training methodology required changing training facilities, changing training protocols, and training personnel in new approaches. The resistance was significant. Physical training instructors at American bases had been conducting standardized programs for years. Changing those programs required admitting that the previous approach had been less than optimal. But gradually, Australian-influenced methodology began to be integrated into American military training. Not everywhere, not comprehensively, but in special operations units and in units that had experienced direct exposure to Australian methodology, the approach began to be adopted. Captain Richard Hayes, a physical training officer at Fort Bragg, encountered Australian training methodology through a training exchange program. Hayes had been conducting standard American physical training protocols for 15 years. He was skeptical when he was introduced to bodyweight-focused, progressive functional movement training. But he decided to experiment. He organized a group of soldiers to participate in Australian-style training alongside a control group that continued traditional weight training. After 3 months, he compared the results. The Australian-style training group developed superior physiques with better muscular definition and lower body fat. More importantly, they demonstrated superior functional capability. They could climb faster. They could navigate obstacles more efficiently. They could maintain performance in challenging environments longer than the traditional weight training group. Hayes was converted. He began implementing Australian training methodology at Fort Bragg. He trained other physical training instructors in the approach. Gradually, Australian-influenced methodology began to become standard practice at special operations training facilities. But this transformation encountered the same resistance that had greeted Australian engineering methodology and Australian reconnaissance tactics. Traditionalists viewed the approach as a threat. Senior military leaders who had built their reputations on traditional training methods were reluctant to acknowledge that those methods might be inferior. One general, Alexander Foster, who oversaw physical training for the entire United States Army, was presented with evidence comparing traditional and Australian-influenced training methodologies. Foster reviewed the evidence and remained unconvinced. Bodyweight training produces inferior results to weight training, Foster stated in a memo. A soldier who can bench press 300 pounds has developed strength that is militarily relevant. A soldier who can do one-arm push-ups has simply learned a circus trick. This memo circulated through military training establishments and became the official position of the Army's physical training leadership. Despite evidence to the contrary, the traditional approach was maintained as the standard. But the memo also inspired those who believed in Australian methodology to document their findings more thoroughly. Hayes conducted additional studies. Other physical training officers conducted their own comparisons. The evidence accumulated. Gradually, the accumulation of evidence became impossible to dismiss. Military personnel trained using Australian-influenced methodology were demonstrably healthier. They had lower injury rates. They possessed superior functional capability. They were more effective in challenging operational environments. By 1969, the Army's physical training leadership had quietly begun to acknowledge that Australian-influenced methodology might have merit. Not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, modifications began to be integrated into training protocols at select facilities. Morrison, who had become something of an evangelist for Australian training methodology, was invited to conduct briefings at the Army War College. He brought photographs of Australian soldiers. He explained the principles. He demonstrated the exercises. The response was gradually positive. Officers, when presented with evidence of superior results, were willing to consider that traditional methodology might need to be revised. By 1970, Australian-influenced training methodology was being incorporated into special operations training across the American military. Not the exclusive approach, but increasingly integrated with traditional methods. The foundation of this transformation was simple. Morrison's physique had been impossible to dismiss. It had been superior to what American military training typically produced. It had been achieved through methodology that contradicted traditional training principles. Therefore, traditional training principles required revision. What had begun with Morrison's observation of Australian soldiers exercising in the heat of a Vietnamese afternoon had become an institutional change in how the American military approached physical training. Sergeant Thomas Brennan, the Australian soldier whose physique had initially impressed Morrison, continued to serve in Vietnam through 1967. His physique remained extraordinary even by Australian standards. He was approached by military leadership with requests to conduct training for American soldiers. Brennan was reluctant. He did not see himself as a trainer. He was a soldier who conducted operations. His physique was simply what happened when you conducted those operations consistently over extended periods. But eventually, he agreed to conduct limited training sessions for interested American soldiers. These sessions followed the same principles that Ashford had taught Morrison: body weight exercises, progressive difficulty, environmental stress as training stimulus. American soldiers who trained under Brennan experienced the same kind of transformation that Morrison had experienced. They developed superior physiques. They developed superior functional capability. They became advocates for Australian training methodology. By the time Brennan rotated out of Vietnam in 1968, he had trained dozens of American soldiers in Australian methodology. Each of those soldiers carried that knowledge back to their own units and influenced their own soldiers. This grassroots knowledge transfer happened without official sanction. It happened because results were visible and difficult to dismiss. A soldier who trained using Australian methodology developed a better physique and greater capability than a soldier who trained using traditional methods. That evidence was more powerful than any official doctrine change. Ashford, who had served as the foundation for this transformation, continued to conduct training until late 1968. When he rotated back to Australia, he left behind a community of American soldiers who had been transformed by understanding that military physique development was not about standardized training protocols, but about functional capability developed through progressive environmental stress. The slouch hat and the boots had been the symbols of Australian methodology in engineering and reconnaissance operations. The Australian physique became the symbol of Australian training methodology. But as with the other aspects of Australian influence, the symbol eventually became more important than the underlying understanding. American soldiers looked at Australian physiques and wanted to replicate them. They began training with barbells and dumbbells, attempting to achieve aesthetic results similar to what Australian soldiers possessed. This approach was partially successful. Soldiers could develop physiques that resembled Australian physiques through appropriate weight training. But they typically failed to develop the functional capability that Australian soldiers possessed. Because functional capability came from environmental stress combined with training, not from isolated exercises. This distinction between aesthetic physique development and functional capability development became an ongoing tension in American military training. Some physical training leaders understood the distinction and incorporated it into their instruction. Others simply focused on developing physiques that looked good, regardless of whether functional capability was being developed. Morrison remained in the military for another 14 years after returning from Vietnam. He rose to the rank of colonel and served as a training command officer, overseeing physical training programs for multiple military units. Throughout his career, he advocated for the incorporation of Australian training principles. His advocacy faced continuing resistance from traditionalists, but his own physique remained as evidence that Australian methodology produced superior results. Even as he aged, Morrison maintained a level of muscularity and physical capability that exceeded what traditional weight training typically produced. When he retired in 1982, Morrison was 60 years old, but possessed a physique that would have been remarkable in a soldier one-third his age. His continued advocacy for Australian training methodology influenced a generation of military physical training instructors. By the 1980s, Australian-influenced training had become an accepted component of military physical training, particularly in special operations units. Not the exclusive approach, but increasingly integrated with traditional methods. The slouch hat was recognized as a symbol of Australian tactical effectiveness. The boots were recognized as symbols of Australian engineering adaptation. The Australian physique was recognized as a symbol of Australian training methodology. What linked all three symbols was a common principle. The Australians had adapted their approach to environmental pressures. They had developed methods that were specifically suited to jungle warfare and the operational demands of Vietnam. They had achieved superior results through this adaptation, and they had been willing to teach Americans what they had learned. The American military, whatever its institutional resistance, had ultimately been willing to learn. The result was gradual transformation across multiple domains: engineering, reconnaissance, physical training. Each domain had been transformed by the incorporation of Australian principles. By 1968, the Australian physique had become something more than just a symbol of superior training methodology. It had become a source of psychological intimidation for American soldiers arriving in Vietnam for the first time. A newly arrived American unit would arrive at Nui Dat, fresh from training at Fort Bragg or Fort Lewis or Fort Jackson. Young soldiers, aged 19 to 22, with physiques developed through standardized American military physical training. They would observe Australian soldiers conducting operations and would experience something approaching shock. The Australians looked like they belonged in a different species of human being. Where American soldiers had relatively average physiques, Australian soldiers appeared almost supernaturally muscular. Where American soldiers had visible body fat deposits, Australian soldiers had virtually no visible body fat. Where American soldiers moved with the general physicality of average athletic young men, Australian soldiers moved with the kind of economical precision that suggested every muscle fiber had been optimized for function. This psychological effect was not intentional. The Australians were not attempting to intimidate American soldiers. They were simply conducting their physical training and their operations using methodology that they had developed over years of operating in jungle environments. But the effect was undeniable. American soldiers, comparing themselves to Australian soldiers, experienced feelings of inadequacy. They perceived themselves as less fit, less capable, less prepared for the demands of combat operations. This perception, while not entirely accurate, had a significant impact on morale and unit cohesion. Lieutenant Colonel James Peterson, who commanded an American infantry battalion operating in the Phuc Tuy province area, observed this psychological effect directly. His soldiers would comment on the Australian physiques. They would wonder how they could develop similar capability. Some would express anxiety about whether their own physical conditioning was adequate for the operational demands they faced. Peterson requested a meeting with the Australian commander in the area to discuss the psychological impact that Australian physiques were having on American soldiers. The meeting occurred in February 1968. "Your soldiers are intimidating my soldiers," Peterson said, not accusingly, but as a simple statement of fact. "My men see the physiques of your soldiers and question whether their own physical conditioning is adequate." The Australian commander, Major William Richardson, was surprised by this assessment. "We are not attempting to intimidate anyone. We are simply conducting our physical training using methodology that has been effective for our operations." "I understand that," Peterson replied, "but the effect is real. My soldiers believe your soldiers are superior athletes and superior soldiers. This is affecting morale." Richardson considered this. "Your soldiers are capable fighters. Physical conditioning is one element of military effectiveness, but not the only element. Your soldiers have advantages in firepower and resources that our soldiers do not possess." Peterson nodded. "But my soldiers do not perceive advantages. They perceive inferiority. They see Australian soldiers and conclude that those soldiers are more capable." This conversation led to an unexpected solution. Richardson authorized several American soldiers to participate in Australian physical training sessions, not as a permanent program, but as an educational opportunity for American soldiers to understand how Australian physiques were developed. The American soldiers who participated in Australian training experienced revelations. They discovered that the exercises that produced Australian physiques were not mysterious or inaccessible. They were bodyweight-based movements that any soldier could perform: progressive difficulty, extended duration, environmental stress. Within weeks, American soldiers who had participated in Australian training began implementing similar training in their own units. They conducted bodyweight exercises. They incorporated progressive difficulty. They extended training duration. The physical transformations were visible. American soldiers began developing physiques that resembled Australian physiques. More importantly, they began developing the kind of functional capability that Australian soldiers possessed. This grassroots training movement spread through American units in the Phuc Tuy province area. Soldiers trained soldiers. Sergeants trained soldiers under their command. Officers authorized training time for the development of functional physical capability. By late 1968, American units operating in the Australian area of operations had begun to develop physiques and physical capabilities that were approaching Australian standards. The psychological intimidation that had existed months earlier began to dissipate. But something more significant had occurred. American soldiers had discovered that superior physique and physical capability were accessible to them. They did not require specialized facilities or expensive equipment. They required consistent training and progressive difficulty, and willingness to push themselves in challenging environmental conditions. This understanding spread beyond the Phuc Tuy province area. Officers who had served in the Australian sector and transferred to other locations brought Australian training methodology with them. Soldiers who had trained using Australian-influenced methods brought the methodology to other units. By 1969, a significant portion of the American military in Vietnam was incorporating Australian-influenced training into their physical preparation. The physical transformation of American soldiers operating in Vietnam became noticeable to observers. American soldiers arriving in 1968 and 1969 possessed physiques that were dramatically superior to American soldiers who had arrived in 1966 and 1967. Journalists and military observers who visited Vietnam noted this change. American soldiers looked different. They looked more muscular. They looked more capable. They looked more like Australian soldiers than they looked like American soldiers who had arrived 2 years earlier. One journalist, Robert Matthews, who spent 3 months in Vietnam in 1969, wrote an article comparing the physiques of American and Australian soldiers. Matthews noted that the physical differences between the two groups had narrowed significantly compared to what he had observed 2 years earlier. The American soldiers of 1969 were dramatically more physically impressive than American soldiers of 1966, Matthews wrote. This transformation appears to have been driven by adoption of training methodology that emphasizes functional strength developed through bodyweight exercises and progressive environmental stress, rather than traditional weight training approaches. Matthews's article created interest in military training circles. If American soldiers could develop superior physiques through Australian-influenced training, what were the implications for military training doctrine? What were the implications for how the American military approached physical development? The article reached General Creighton Abrams, the commander of MACV. Abrams, who had already been impressed by the effectiveness of Australian engineering methodology and Australian reconnaissance tactics, began to question whether the American military was approaching physical training in the optimal manner. Abrams commissioned a study comparing physical development in American and Australian soldiers. The study was conducted by military medical personnel and physical training specialists. It examined body composition, functional strength, cardiovascular capacity, and operational performance. The results were comprehensive and conclusive. Australian soldiers developed superior physiques with greater muscularity and lower body fat. Australian soldiers demonstrated superior functional strength. Australian soldiers demonstrated superior endurance in sustained operational conditions. More significantly, American soldiers who had adopted Australian training methodology showed marked improvements in these same metrics compared to American soldiers who were training using traditional weight training approaches. The implications were clear. Australian training methodology produced superior results. The American military should consider adopting aspects of Australian methodology. But the resistance remained. Physical training establishment personnel at various American military installations had built their careers on traditional training approaches. Acknowledging that Australian methodology might be superior represented a threat to their expertise and their authority. General Alexander Foster, who oversaw physical training doctrine for the entire Army, continued to resist the incorporation of Australian methodology. Foster was a traditionalist who had spent his career implementing weight training programs and believing that weight training was the optimal approach to military physical development. Foster's resistance was not based on evidence. It was based on ideological commitment to traditional methodology. When presented with evidence that Australian training methodology produced superior results, Foster dismissed the evidence. The study you reference compared soldiers in different operational contexts, Foster argued. The Australians are operating in limited geographic area with limited scope of operations. The Americans are operating across much larger areas with greater operational diversity. The different results are attributable to operational context, not training methodology. This argument, while superficially plausible, ignored the central finding of the study. American soldiers who trained using Australian methodology showed superior results regardless of operational context. American soldiers operating in the Phuc Tuy province area, who had adopted Australian training methodology, showed superior physical development and functional capability compared to American soldiers operating in the same geographic area who had not adopted Australian training methodology. The evidence was compelling if one was willing to accept it, but institutional resistance to change is powerful. Physical training establishment personnel continued to implement traditional weight training programs.
Many military installations continued to resist the adoption of Australian methodology. However, the changes were undeniable. By 1970, the American military had begun incorporating Australian training principles into official training doctrine, at least at special operations training facilities, and at facilities where personnel had direct exposure to Australian methodology. Morrison, who had become the primary advocate for Australian training methodology within the American military, faced a difficult question. The transformation was happening, but it was happening slowly and incompletely. How could the transformation be accelerated? Morrison decided to write a comprehensive training manual that documented Australian training methodology and explained the principles underlying the approach. The manual would be distributed to military training facilities and would provide guidance for how to implement Australian influence training. Morrison's manual, titled Functional Strength Development Through Progressive Environmental Stress, was completed in 1969. The manual was classified as unclassified and was made available to military training installations throughout the American military. The manual provided detailed explanation of why Australian methodology was effective. It documented the principles of progressive difficulty, functional movement patterns, and environmental stress as training stimuli. It provided specific exercises and progressions.
It explained how to adapt training to different environments and different operational requirements. Most importantly, the manual made clear that Australian training methodology was not dependent on specialized facilities or equipment. It could be implemented anywhere by any military organization willing to commit to the training principles. The manual began circulating through military training establishments. Some installations embraced it immediately. Others were skeptical. Some resisted it overtly. But the manual had an impact that Morrison had not entirely anticipated. It provided intellectual ammunition for military training officers who believed that Australian methodology was superior. When traditionalists resisted the adoption of Australian principles, these officers could reference Morrison's manual and say, "Here is the documentation, here is the evidence, here is how to implement this." Gradually, the manual became the foundation for transforming American military physical training. By 1971, after the Vietnam War had essentially ended for most American forces, Australian training methodology had been officially incorporated into the training doctrine of special operations units. The incorporation was not complete. Traditional weight training continued to be used, but Australian-influenced methodology had become an accepted and increasingly standard component of military physical training. The slouch hat was a symbol. The boots were a symbol.
The physique was a symbol. What linked these three symbols was the Australian approach to military effectiveness. The Australians had adapted every aspect of their military operations to the specific environmental conditions of Vietnam. They had adapted their tactics. They had adapted their equipment. They had adapted their physical training. The American military, which had arrived in Vietnam with sophisticated equipment and established doctrine, had gradually recognized that established doctrine was insufficient for the specific conditions of jungle warfare. They had been forced to learn from an ally who understood those conditions better. This learning was not comfortable. It required American military leaders to acknowledge that American approaches might be inferior in specific contexts. It required American soldiers to question assumptions about how military operations should be conducted. It required American military training establishments to accept that traditional methodology might need to be revised. But the learning had occurred. and the American military, which left Vietnam with less territory held and strategic objectives unmet, left with something else: understanding. Understanding of how to conduct effective operations in difficult terrain. Understanding of how to develop superior physical capability without expensive equipment or specialized facilities. Understanding of how to adapt doctrine to environmental pressures. That understanding, carried forward by officers like Morrison, influenced military training for decades. The slouch hat and the boots had been temporary symbols, relevant primarily to Vietnam. But the training methodology that Australian soldiers had developed persisted. It became integrated into how American Special Operations soldiers were trained. It became integrated into how military organizations around the world approached physical development. Sergeant Thomas Brennan died in 1992. He had remained in the Australian military after returning from Vietnam. He had continued to conduct physical training and had continued to demonstrate the kind of physique that had initially impressed Captain Morrison. When journalists contacted him late in his life and asked about his role in influencing American military training, Brennan was modest. "I simply trained the way I was trained. The Americans noticed and wanted to understand. I explained the principles. The results were what they were." Brennan had understood something fundamental about physical training that many American training specialists had missed. The physique was not the goal. The physique was the evidence of functional capability. When soldiers developed genuine functional capability, the physique developed naturally as a consequence. This understanding was difficult for American military training specialists to internalize because American military culture had long emphasized the physique as the goal. Bigger muscles, lower body fat, more impressive appearance. The assumption was that impressive appearance was associated with capability. The Australians understood something different. Impressive appearance was a byproduct of developing genuine functional capability. If you focused on developing capability, the appearance would follow naturally. This distinction, seemingly subtle, was actually fundamental. It changed how military training should be approached. Instead of training for aesthetic results, you trained for functional results. Instead of executing specific exercises to develop specific muscles, you executed movement patterns that developed integrated functional capability. The consequences of this philosophical shift were substantial. Soldiers trained using Australian methodology were healthier. They had lower injury rates because they were developing balanced functional capability rather than isolated muscle development. They had greater endurance. They had superior performance in challenging operational environments. All of this could be traced back to a fundamental difference in approach. Australian military leaders had asked the question, what capability is required for effective operations in jungle environments? They had designed training around that question. American military leaders had asked the question, how do we develop impressive physiques? They had designed training around that question. Morrison had recognized this distinction and had attempted to educate American military leadership about it. His efforts had been partially successful. Australian-influenced methodology had been incorporated into American military training, particularly in special operations, but the underlying philosophical distinction remained somewhat obscure. By the year 2000, military training specialists were beginning to recognize the validity of functional training approaches. The term functional training was becoming increasingly common in military and civilian fitness contexts. Bodyweight exercises were being recognized as valuable alternatives to weight training. Progressive difficulty and environmental stress were being recognized as important training principles. All of this represented a vindication of Australian training methodology. The principles that Ashford and Brennan had demonstrated to Morrison in 1966 and 1967 had become part of the standard body of military training knowledge. But attribution of these principles to Australian sources was often obscure. Most military training specialists in the year 2000 had no idea that functional training principles had origins in Australian military experience in Vietnam. The methodology had become so integrated into standard practice that its origins were lost to history. Morrison lived until 2003.
In his final years, he occasionally gave lectures on the history of military training, describing his experience with Australian soldiers and his efforts to incorporate Australian training methodology into American military training. He would show photographs of Australian soldiers from 1966 and 1967. He would show photographs of American soldiers who had adopted Australian training methodology. He would describe how American soldiers had evolved from questioning whether they were physically adequate to developing physiques and capabilities that matched their Australian counterparts. And he would conclude with an observation that connected the physical training transformation to the larger pattern of American learning from Australian military experience. The slouch hat was not stupid. The boots were not farmer's wear. The physiques were not the result of specialized training in equipped facilities. The Australians had adapted every aspect of their military operations to the specific conditions of jungle warfare. We resisted learning from them initially, but eventually we recognized that they had something important to teach. The physical training methodology was just one aspect of what we learned, but it was an important aspect because it was visible. It was undeniable. A soldier could observe an Australian physique and either accept that a different training approach produced superior results or deny the evidence in front of his eyes.
Most soldiers eventually accepted the evidence. That acceptance led to broader acceptance of other Australian methodologies. The slouch hat, the boots, and the physique were all symbols of the same principle. Adaptation to environmental pressures produces superior military effectiveness. We learned that principle in Vietnam. That principle has persisted long after the Vietnam War ended. Morrison died peacefully in his sleep in Virginia, the same state where Stanton had died decades earlier. The Australian Defence Force sent an official representative to his funeral. The representative read a statement acknowledging Morrison's role in bringing Australian training methodology to the American military and his advocacy for the adoption of Australian principles throughout his military career. It was a quiet acknowledgement of a profound historical moment. The slouch hat and the boots and the Australian physique had been the visible symbols of Australian military adaptation, but the real transformation had been intellectual. American military leaders had been forced to question fundamental assumptions about how military training should be approached. They had been forced to recognize that their established approaches might be insufficient. They had been forced to learn from an ally. That learning, while incomplete and sometimes resistant, had ultimately resulted in improvements to American military training that persisted for decades. The Australians, with their slouch hats and their boots and their extraordinary physiques, had taught the American military a lesson that went far beyond the specific context of Vietnam. They had demonstrated that military effectiveness was not about size or resources or established doctrine. It was about adaptation to specific environmental conditions. It was about willingness to question assumptions. It was about learning from allies who understood those conditions better. That lesson remained relevant decades after the Vietnam War ended. It remained relevant in subsequent military conflicts and subsequent military training contexts. It remained relevant in any situation where military organizations faced environmental pressures that exceeded their existing doctrine. The slouch hat had become an icon. The boots had become symbols. The physique had become evidence. But the real legacy was intellectual. The legacy was understanding. The legacy was the recognition that military effectiveness required continuous learning and continuous adaptation. That legacy, carried forward by officers and soldiers who had experienced Australian training methodology, influenced military training around the world. Not always with acknowledgement of Australian origins,
not always with explicit reference to the lessons learned in Vietnam, but the principles remained. The methodology remained. The understanding remained.
All of it traced back to 1966, when Captain Derek Morrison observed Australian soldiers exercising in the heat of a Vietnamese afternoon and asked a question that would define the rest of his military career. How did they develop those physiques? The answer to that question, pursued over months and years and decades, became a transformation in how the American military approached physical training. That transformation was not visible in any single moment. It was not announced in any official doctrine change. It occurred gradually through the cumulative effect of soldiers learning from soldiers, officers learning from officers, training being adapted and refined and improved based on evidence. But it was real, and it persisted, and it mattered. Because training is the foundation upon which military effectiveness is built, and when training methodology improves, military effectiveness improves. And when military effectiveness improves, soldiers are more capable. And when soldiers are more capable, fewer of them die unnecessarily. That was the final significance of the Australian physique. It was not just a symbol of superior training. It was a symbol of the possibility that military organizations could improve, could learn, could adapt. That soldiers could become more capable. That the human body, given proper training stimulus and proper training principles, could develop capabilities that seemed impossible until proven otherwise.
The slouch hat remains in military museums. The boots remain in military archives. The photographs of Australian soldiers with their extraordinary physiques remain in historical records. But the real legacy, the understanding that training should focus on functional capability rather than aesthetic development, that environmental stress should be incorporated into training stimulus, that progressive difficulty should be the foundation for training progression. That legacy lives on in every military training facility in the world that has adopted functional training principles. Even if they do not know it, soldiers being trained in functional fitness are being trained using principles developed by Australian soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam. The attribution is lost to history. The principles remain. That is perhaps the most Australian outcome possible, the recognition forgotten, the results enduring.